In the spring of 1565, the most powerful empire on earth set its sights on a small island in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire, fresh from conquering Constantinople and dominating the eastern seas, assembled an armada so massive that witnesses claimed the vessels stretched from horizon to horizon. 40,000 of the Sultan's finest warriors, battle-hardened from campaigns across 3 continents, prepared to descend upon Malta. Standing in their way were fewer than 6,000 defenders, a ragtag collection of knights, soldiers, and Maltese civilians who had nowhere to run. What followed was not just a siege. It was 4 months of unimaginable brutality that would determine whether Christian Europe would survive or whether the Ottoman tide would sweep across the Mediterranean unopposed. This is the story of how a handful of determined men, led by a 70-year-old warrior, defied an empire and changed the course of history. To understand why Malta became the stage for such carnage, you have to understand what the island represented in 1565. Malta was not wealthy. It possessed no gold mines, no sprawling cities, no agricultural riches worth coveting. What it had was position. Sitting directly between Ottoman-controlled North Africa and Christian-controlled Sicily, Malta was a dagger pointed at the heart of Ottoman expansion. And, holding that dagger, were the Knights of St. John, a military religious order that had made itself the single most effective fighting force against Ottoman naval power. These knights were not monks who occasionally picked up swords. They were professional warriors who had taken vows to wage perpetual war against Islam. For decades, they had raided Ottoman shipping, liberated Christian slaves, and humiliated Turkish admirals in naval engagements across the Mediterranean. The Sultan, Suleiman the Magnificent, had tolerated them when they were based in Rhodes, but after finally driving them from that island in 1522, he had watched them establish themselves in Malta and resume their raids with even greater intensity. By 1565, Suleiman was 70 years old, the longest reigning sultan in Ottoman history, a man who had conquered Belgrade, Rhodes, and much of Hungary. He had one final ambition before death claimed him. He would crush the Knights of St. John, seize Malta, and open the door to invading Sicily and mainland Italy. The West would fall, and his legacy would be complete. The man who would command the defense of Malta was Jean Perisseau de Valette, the Grand Master of the Knights of St. John. At 70 years old, Valette was not supposed to be a battlefield commander. Most men his age were preparing for comfortable deaths, surrounded by family and servants. Valette was preparing for war. He had joined the order as a young man and spent his entire adult life fighting Ottomans. He had survived the Siege of Rhodes in 1522, spending the next year as a galley slave after being captured by Barbary corsairs. He knew what Ottoman captivity meant. He had rowed in chains, felt the whip across his back, and seen men die chained to their oars. When he was finally ransomed, he returned to the order and rose through its ranks, not through politics, but through pure competence in warfare. By 1565, he had been Grand Master for 8 years, and he understood 2 critical truths. First, the Ottomans were coming, and no amount of diplomacy would stop them. Second, if Malta fell, no Christian power in the Mediterranean would be safe. He began preparing the island's defenses with the methodical intensity of a man who knew exactly what was at stake.
Discipline and strength, knights. Trust your training. We flank 3 to dawn. Victory demands unity.
I accept, says Judge, to lead with wisdom and honor.
The bastion must be reinforced! Work with haste! Yes, Commander! No delays! The enemy draws near! Strengthen that parapet!
Malta's defenses centered on 3 fortified positions: Fort St. Elmo, guarding the entrance to the Grand Harbor, Fort St. Angelo in Birgu, the main headquarters of the Knights, and Fort St. Michael in Senglea, protecting Birgu's flank. None of these fortifications were modern star forts. They were medieval strongholds that had been hastily upgraded with whatever resources the Knights could muster. Valette knew they were inadequate. He requested reinforcements from every Christian power in Europe. Spain promised help but was characteristically slow to mobilize. The Pope sent token support. Other kingdoms offered prayers but little else. By May 1565, when Ottoman scouts were spotted off Malta's coast, Valette commanded approximately 540 knights, 4,000 Spanish and Italian soldiers, and about 4,000 Maltese militia and civilians who could bear arms. Against the force that was about to arrive, it was pitifully inadequate. But Valette had no intention of fighting fairly. He planned to make the Ottomans bleed for every inch of Maltese rock. On May 18, 1565, the Ottoman Armada arrived. The sight must have been overwhelming. Nearly 200 ships materialized off the coast, their sails blotting out the horizon. 40,000 men began disembarking on Malta's shores, an invasion force larger than most European armies. The expedition was commanded by Mustafa Pasha, a 70-year-old veteran who had served Suleiman for decades. He was cautious, methodical, and experienced in siege warfare. Beside him was Piali Pasha, the admiral of the Ottoman fleet, young and aggressive, eager to prove himself. This divided command would prove problematic, but in those first days, it hardly seemed to matter. The Ottomans possessed overwhelming superiority in numbers, artillery, and resources. Mustafa's plan was straightforward: seize Fort Elmo to secure the harbor, then systematically reduce Birgu and Sanglia. It was a sound strategy. If executed properly, Malta would fall within weeks. Fort St. Elmo sat on a narrow peninsula jutting into the sea, guarding the entrance to Marsamexet Harbor and the Grand Harbor. It was not a formidable fortress. Its walls were relatively low, its garrison numbered only about 150 knights and soldiers, and Mustafa's engineers estimated it would fall in less than a week. Valette knew St. Elmo could not hold indefinitely, but he also understood something Mustafa did not yet appreciate. Every day St. Elmo stood was a day his main defenses in Birgu could be strengthened. Every Ottoman soldier killed at St. Elmo was one less soldier who would assault Birgu. He ordered the fort held at all costs and promised to send reinforcements as needed. The men in St. Elmo understood their mission. They were not expected to win. They were expected to die slowly, buying time with their blood. The bombardment of Fort St. Elmo began on May 24th. Ottoman artillery, including massive siege guns that fired stone balls weighing over 150 pounds, opened fire from positions surrounding the fort. The noise was apocalyptic. Day and night, the guns roared, smashing into St. Elmo's walls, collapsing sections of rampart, filling the air with choking dust and flying stone fragments. The defenders huddled behind whatever cover remained, knowing that each bombardment presaged another assault. The Ottomans attacked in waves, elite Janissaries leading the charges, their discipline and ferocity unmatched by any infantry in the world. They carried scaling ladders, arquebuses, and curved scimitars, and they came screaming their war cries, convinced that Allah favored their cause. The defenders met them with everything they had: cannons loaded with chain shot and scrap metal, arquebuses fired at point-blank range, boiling oil poured from the walls, and when the enemy reached the ramparts, desperate hand-to-hand combat with swords, pikes, and anything that could kill. The fighting at St. Elmo was not chivalric. It was butchery. Men were blown apart by cannon fire, burned alive by incendiary weapons, or hacked to pieces in brutal melee combat. The fort's interior became a charnel house. Wounded men lay wherever there was space, groaning in agony, with no effective medical care available. The smell of death, gunpowder, and decay became inescapable. Yet the defenders held. Every assault was repelled, though each cost more lives. Mustafa, furious at the delay, poured more troops into the attacks. His week-long estimate became 2 weeks, then 3. The siege of Fort St. Elmo was devouring his army. Valette, watching from Birgu across the harbor, sent small boats at night carrying reinforcements and supplies. It was a suicide mission for those volunteers, but men kept stepping forward. They knew what they were sailing toward. They went anyway. By mid-June, Fort St. Elmo was barely recognizable. Its walls were rubble in places, held together by desperation, and the bodies of the dead used to plug breaches. The garrison was reduced to a fraction of its original strength. Wounded men who could still hold weapons returned to the walls. There was no thought of surrender. The knights had seen what happened to Ottoman prisoners. Captured defenders were crucified, beheaded, or impaled. Their bodies were mutilated and floated across the harbor to demoralize Birgu's defenders. Valette's response was equally brutal. He executed Ottoman prisoners and fired their heads from cannons back at the Turkish lines. This was total war, and mercy had no place in it. On June 23rd, after a month of siege, the Ottomans launched their final assault on Fort St. Elmo. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, throwing everything into the effort. Thousands of troops stormed the shattered fortress, climbing over rubble and bodies, overwhelming the exhausted defenders through sheer weight of numbers. The last knights fought to the death in the fort's chapel, surrounded and outnumbered, refusing quarter. When silence finally fell over St. Elmo, the Ottomans had their victory. But the cost was staggering. Mustafa had lost between 6,000 and 8,000 men, including some of his best Janissaries and officers. The siege that should have taken a week had consumed a month. And when Mustafa stood on St. Elmo's ruined walls and looked across the harbor at Birgu and Sanglia, he reportedly said, "If the child has cost us so much, what will the father cost?" He had no idea how prophetic those words would prove. The fall of St. Elmo sent shockwaves through Birgu. The defenders had watched the fort's agony from across the water, powerless to save their brothers. Now the Ottomans controlled the heights overlooking both harbors and could position artillery to bombard Birgu and Senglia directly. Mustafa wasted no time. He established massive gun batteries and began a bombardment that made St. Elmo's suffering look restrained. Ottoman cannon fire hammered the defenses day and night. Buildings collapsed. Church bells were melted by heat. The civilian population huddled in whatever shelter they could find while stone and metal rained from the sky. Valette moved through the chaos, constantly visible, directing repairs, encouraging his men seemingly indifferent to the death falling around him. His presence was magnetic. Here was a 70-year-old man refusing to take cover, calmly giving orders while cannonballs struck nearby. His courage became legendary, and it stiffened the resolve of every defender. The Ottoman assault on Birgu and Senglia began in earnest in early July. Mustafa's strategy was to attack both positions simultaneously, preventing Valette from concentrating his forces. The attacks followed a brutal pattern: artillery bombardment, then mass infantry assaults against the walls, with Janissaries and other elite troops leading the way. The defenders fought from behind hastily repaired walls, from barricaded streets, from the windows and rooftops of buildings. The Knights of St. John, identifiable by their distinctive red surcoats with white crosses, were always at the points of greatest danger. They had taken vows to defend Christendom, and they honored those vows in blood. Alongside them fought Spanish and Italian soldiers, professional troops who knew their business. And crucially, the Maltese civilians fought with desperate courage. This was their home. If Malta fell, they faced enslavement or death. Men, women, and even children contributed to the defense, carrying ammunition, tending the wounded, or fighting when the walls were breached. The fighting throughout July and August reached levels of intensity almost impossible to describe. There were no days off, no pauses for rest. The Ottomans attacked relentlessly, convinced that sheer persistence would break the defenders. On several occasions, Turkish troops breached the walls and fighting spilled into Birgu's streets. These were the most desperate moments, when the entire defense threatened to collapse. Valette personally led counterattacks, sword in hand, pushing the invaders back through brutal hand-to-hand combat. His age became irrelevant. He fought like a man possessed, and his presence at the critical point rallied defenders who were on the verge of breaking. Time and again, the Ottomans were thrown back, leaving piles of their dead in the breaches and at the wall's base. Mustafa employed every siege technique known to warfare. His engineers dug mines under the walls, attempting to collapse them with explosive charges. Valette's sappers countermined, and vicious underground battles took place in claustrophobic tunnels lit by torches, men stabbing and clubbing each other in the darkness. The Ottomans attempted amphibious assaults, rowing boats into the harbors to attack from the sea. These were met with cannon fire and incendiary weapons that turned the water into a flaming hell. Turkish troops died by the hundreds, drowning in their armor or burning alive. The defenders suffered too. Casualties mounted steadily. Knights who had survived decades of combat fell to Turkish bullets or blades. Soldiers were crushed by falling masonry or torn apart by artillery. The hospitals overflowed with wounded and dying men. Surgeons worked by candlelight, amputating shattered limbs without anesthesia, knowing most of their patients would die from infection even if they survived the procedure. By August, both sides were exhausted. The Ottomans had lost thousands of men, their morale was cracking, and disease was spreading through their camps. The defenders were down to a few thousand effectives, many of them wounded, all of them pushed beyond normal human endurance. But Valette refused to consider surrender. He knew relief was coming. Spain had finally mobilized a relief force, and reports suggested it would arrive in September. All he had to do was hold until then. But could they survive another month? Mustafa decided to stake everything on one massive assault. On August 7th, he launched a coordinated attack on both Birgu and Senglia, with virtually his entire remaining combat strength. Ottoman troops advanced under heavy covering fire, carrying scaling ladders and siege towers, determined to swarm the defenses through overwhelming numbers. The fighting that day exceeded anything that had come before. The walls disappeared under masses of attacking soldiers. Defenders fought from the ramparts, from the streets behind the walls, from inside buildings, anywhere they could find cover. The knights wielded swords and warhammers with mechanical efficiency, killing with every stroke. Spanish arquebusiers fired until their gun barrels glowed red hot. Maltese fighters threw rocks, boiling water, anything that could hurt the enemy. For hours, the outcome hung in the balance. If the Ottomans could establish a lodgment inside the defenses, it was over. At the critical moment, Valette played his final card. He had kept a small cavalry force in reserve, hidden in Medina, Malta's old capital in the island's interior. Now he ordered them to attack the Ottoman rear. It was barely 100 horsemen, but they thundered into the Turkish siege camps, sabering sentries, setting fires, and creating chaos. Mustafa, hearing reports of a major attack from behind, panicked. He believed a relief force had landed and was attacking his rear. He ordered a general withdrawal. The August 7th assault collapsed. The Ottomans pulled back, and the defenders, barely able to believe they had survived, watched them retreat. They had held. Barely, impossibly, they had held. The Ottoman army was broken. Mustafa had lost over half his invasion force. His elite Janissaries were devastated. Disease and combat exhaustion had rendered thousands more ineffective. His subordinate commanders were openly questioning the campaign's wisdom. And then, on September 7th, the Spanish relief force arrived. It was not a massive army, perhaps 8,000 fresh troops, but it did not need to be. The psychological impact was decisive. Mustafa, facing a revitalized enemy and reinforcements, made the painful decision to withdraw. On September 11th, the Ottoman fleet weighed anchor and sailed away from Malta. The siege was over. The aftermath was stark. Malta's landscape was devastated. Whole towns had been reduced to rubble. Bodies lay everywhere, decomposing in the heat. Of the original 6,000 defenders, perhaps 3,000 survived unwounded. The Knights of St. John had lost a third of their number. The Maltese population had suffered terribly. But they had won. Against impossible odds, a tiny garrison had defeated the Ottoman Empire's largest invasion force. The Ottomans had lost between 20,000 and 30,000 men, countless ships, and immeasurable prestige. Suleiman the Magnificent, receiving news of the defeat, reportedly wept. He had staked his legacy on taking Malta and had been humiliated. He died the following year, his final ambition unfulfilled. The strategic consequences of Malta's defense rippled across Europe. The myth of Ottoman invincibility was shattered. Christian powers, which had cowered before Turkish expansion for decades, found new courage. The Knights of St. John became legendary, and volunteers flocked to join their ranks. The order would go on to construct Valette, one of Europe's most formidable fortress cities, named for the Grand Master who had defied an empire. Malta would never again face such an existential threat. The Mediterranean balance of power had shifted, and the Ottoman tide that had seemed unstoppable had finally been turned back. What made the defense of Malta possible? Superior fortifications played a role, but St. Elmo and the original defenses were hardly impregnable. Numbers certainly did not favor the defenders. The difference was leadership and will. Valette understood that sieges are not won by passive resistance. They are won by making the attacker pay in blood for every inch, by counterattacking at critical moments, by refusing to accept defeat even when all logic says defeat is certain. He fought not to survive but to win. And that mentality transmitted itself to every man under his command. The knights believed they were engaged in a holy war, and that belief gave them strength beyond normal human capacity. The Maltese fought for their homes and families with the desperation of those who have no alternative. And crucially, Mustafa's divided command and the split between him and Piali created hesitations and strategic mistakes that a unified Ottoman command might have avoided. The siege also demonstrated the limits of numerical superiority against fortified positions defended by determined troops. 40,000 Ottomans should have been more than enough to overwhelm 6,000 defenders. But siege warfare is not mathematics. It is attritional, grinding, and morale-dependent. The attackers must constantly expose themselves to defensive fire, must climb walls under attack, must breach fortifications while defenders pour death upon them. The psychological toll is immense. Every assault that fails strengthens the defender's confidence and erodes the attacker's morale. By August, Ottoman troops were attacking less aggressively, taking cover more readily, showing all the signs of an army that had lost faith in victory. The defenders, though physically exhausted, gained psychological strength from every successful defense. They began to believe they could win, and that belief became self-fulfilling. There is a temptation to romanticize the Siege of Malta, to see it through the lens of crusading mythology as a clean conflict between good and evil. The reality was far more complex and brutal. Both sides committed atrocities, prisoners were mutilated and executed, civilians were killed. The rules of civilized warfare, such as they were in the 16th century, were abandoned early. This was existential conflict where surrender meant enslavement or death, so neither side offered quarter. The Knights of St. John were warrior monks who genuinely believed they were doing God's work, but they were also a military organization that survived through piracy and slave-taking when not fighting formal battles. The Ottomans saw themselves as spreading the true faith and punishing those who raided Muslim shipping. Both sides believed absolutely in the righteousness of their cause, and that absolute conviction fueled the horrific violence. The human cost of the siege was staggering. Malta's population was traumatized. Entire families were wiped out. The island's economy was shattered. It would take decades to fully recover. The knights lost some of their finest warriors, men who had dedicated their entire lives to the order and whose experience was irreplaceable. The Ottoman Empire lost not just troops, but also naval assets, artillery, and the aura of invincibility that had been perhaps their greatest psychological weapon. Suleiman's prestige never recovered. His final years were marked by bitterness and failure, a stark contrast to the conquering glory of his youth and middle age. From a purely military perspective, the Siege of Malta offers lessons that remain relevant. Fortifications, even imperfect ones, multiply the effectiveness of defenders many times over. Leadership at the critical point is decisive. Valette's presence at every crisis point prevented collapses that would otherwise have been inevitable. Combined arms coordination matters. The Ottomans' failure to effectively coordinate their naval and land forces created opportunities the defenders exploited. Morale and will can overcome material disadvantages. The defenders had fewer men, less artillery, worse fortifications, and no realistic hope of outside relief for most of the siege. Yet they prevailed through sheer refusal to quit. And finally, even overwhelming force requires careful application. The Ottomans had the numbers to win, but squandered them through predictable tactics and divided command. The Siege of Malta also represents a historical turning point where Europe could have lost, but did not. If Malta had fallen, the Ottomans would have had a secure base to invade Sicily, then mainland Italy. The Papal States, Naples, and potentially Rome itself would have been under threat. Spain, already stretched thin defending its vast empire, could not have simultaneously defended Italy and its other interests. The entire Western Mediterranean would have become an Ottoman lake. European trade routes would have been strangled. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, all the developments that would shape the modern world, would have unfolded very differently under the shadow of continued Ottoman expansion. Malta's defense ensured that European civilization survived its greatest existential threat since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Yet history is contingent. If Valette had been a lesser man, if the Spanish relief force had been delayed another month, if Mustafa had concentrated on Birgu first instead of wasting resources on St. Elmo, if any of a dozen variables had been different, Malta would have fallen. The defenders succeeded not because victory was inevitable, but because they made it possible through courage, skill, and unbreakable will. They understood what was at stake and refused to accept defeat regardless of the odds. In the end, that made all the difference. The memory of 1565 haunted Ottoman strategic thinking for generations. The empire would continue to be a formidable power, but its expansion into the Western Mediterranean was finished. Future Ottoman leaders, contemplating attacks on Christian holdings, would remember Malta and hesitate. The psychological wound was permanent. Meanwhile, Christian Europe, which had spent decades in fearful defensive posture, rediscovered its confidence. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, where a Christian naval coalition crushed the Ottoman fleet, was a direct consequence of the spirit revived at Malta. The tide had turned, and everyone knew it. For the Knights of St. John, the siege became their defining moment. They had been founded during the Crusades, had held Rhodes for centuries, and had continued their mission from Malta. But nothing in their long history compared to 1565. They had stood alone against the mightiest empire on earth and won. The order would continue for another 232 years, finally dissolved by Napoleon in 1798. But those 4 months in 1565 remained their finest hour. Every knight who joined after 1565 did so, knowing he was entering an organization that had achieved the impossible. The 8-pointed Maltese cross they wore became a symbol recognized across Europe as representing uncommon valor and unshakable faith. The Maltese people gained their own legend from the siege. They had fought alongside the knights as equals, proving that common civilians could match professional soldiers in courage when defending their homeland. The Maltese identity was forged in those crucible months. Centuries later, when Malta again faced existential threat during World War II's aerial siege, Maltese defenders explicitly invoked the spirit of 1565. The island's ability to absorb punishment and refuse defeat seemed encoded in its DNA. George Cross, awarded to Malta in 1942, recognized the same qualities Jean de Valette had seen in his Maltese comrades nearly 400 years earlier. Historical controversies surround specific details of the siege. Casualty figures vary wildly between sources. The exact number of defenders and attackers is disputed. Some historians argue the Ottoman threat to Europe was exaggerated and Malta's strategic importance overstated. Others contend the siege was Christianity's last stand and that defeat would have been apocalyptic. These debates will continue as long as historians study the period. But certain facts are indisputable. A vastly outnumbered garrison held against enormous odds. Leadership and morale proved decisive. and the Ottoman Empire's westward expansion was permanently halted. The physical scars of the siege are still visible in Malta today. Fort St. Angelo, Fort St. Michael, and the ruins of Fort St. Elmo remain, their stones pockmarked by cannon fire. Valette, the fortress city built after the siege, stands as perhaps the most tangible legacy of 1565. Walking its streets, you can still sense the determination that went into its construction. This would never happen again, the builders seemed to declare. Malta would become impregnable. And largely it did. Future enemies would bypass Malta rather than attempt its conquest. Testimony to the reputation earned during those 4 months. Jean de Valette did not live long after the siege. He died in 1568, just 3 years after his greatest triumph, at the age of 74. He died in his bed, a rare fate for a man who had spent his entire adult life in warfare. His legacy was secure. He had saved Malta, stopped the Ottoman advance, and given Christian Europe the breathing room it desperately needed. His name became synonymous with successful defense against overwhelming odds. Military academies would study his tactics. Leaders facing impossible situations would invoke his example. And the city built on the Sybaris Peninsula, where Fort St. Elmo once stood alone, would bear his name, Valette, the city of the knight who refused to yield. The Siege of Malta, 1565, stands as one of history's great what-if moments. What if the defenders had broken? What if Spanish relief had never arrived? What if Suleiman had lived to personally command the operation? These counterfactuals are tantalizing but ultimately unanswerable. What we know is what happened. 6,000 men, led by a 70-year-old warrior who refused to consider defeat, held against 40,000 of the finest soldiers the Ottoman Empire could field. They did not merely survive. They won decisively, breaking the enemy's will and sending them home in defeat. It was a military achievement that seems almost impossible, yet it happened. The walls, the weapons, the tactics, these were important, but in the end, it came down to human courage and will. Malta proved that even in the face of impossible odds, determined defenders who refuse to quit can prevail. That lesson resonates across the centuries. It is why we remember the Siege of Malta. And it is why Jean de Valette and his men deserve to be remembered as among history's greatest defenders.